Thank you so much, Prof, for coming. That's a very important one, the link between law and finance, law and debt, law and development finance, which I think is an interesting perspective.
Yes.
But before we actually get into the legal aspects of it, we would like to know from you how SDR reforms can be strategically aligned with this call for global financial architecture reforms.
Yeah.
And I know this also has some legal elements because these are all about laws, these are about rules. So we would like to know how you can align these reforms, these SDR reforms, with the broader calls for global financial architecture reforms.
Yeah, so I mean, that's an important question. I think primarily because the system for allocation of SDRs is based on the quotas or shares that countries have in the IMF. And the structure of the shares is identified in the Articles of Agreement, the treaty that establishes the International Monetary Fund. When that system was put in place, the thought was that each country, based on any number of criteria, would buy shares in the fund that would represent the total number of votes that it would have, and that would also determine the allocation of SDRs, the sovereign, the SDRs in the International Monetary Fund, which are the unit of account for all IMF transactions, loans or SDRs. The way that it is currently structured, for example, if you take Ivory Coast, where we are hosted today, Ivory Coast has only 0.05% of the quota shares in the IMF. So it means its voice and vote is only 0.05%. The whole of Africa, the 54 African countries that are members of the IMF, have only 6.47% of the total shares or quotas in the IMF. So it means that if there was an SDR allocation, the entitlement to which Africa is can get is only 6.47% of the total SDR allocation. If you look at another, and just to finish that thought, if you contrast Africa's total votes or shares or voting shares in the IMF to those of the United States has 16.5% of all the total shares or votes in the IMF. So it means that to reallocate the quota system, which determines allocation of SDRs, the US would have to acquiesce to changes in the quota formula because it takes 85% of the total shares of the IMF to change the quota system. So this is written in the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund. It's not a policy position, it's just the fact that the treaty that establishes the IMF provides what effectively is a veto to the United States. So it is not a surprise that the United States is not in support of any fundamental changes to the global debt and financial architecture because it would mean giving up this veto power it has on the operations of the IMF insofar as any fundamental changes, whether it's to any policy frameworks or in this particular case to the allocation of quotas. The other dimension for voice and voting in the IMF is executive directors. Africa had until 2023 only 2 executive directors who sit on the executive board, which is sort of the executive arm of the IMF. And in 2023, 1 more executive director from Sub-Saharan Africa was added. That is insufficient, obviously, to represent 54 countries with over a billion people, compared to the big economies like the US, the UK, and others that have each their own executive director that sits on the executive board, so that you can see that there are many ways in which the system is designed in favor of the richest countries, and obviously in ways that are very consequential for developing countries, especially those in Africa that have a marginal voice and vote relative to those big economies.
Thank you, Prof. This brings to focus what we have been advocating for, this idea of Africa being a rule maker and not just a rule taker within this system.
Yes.
And what you have just described here, it's like a very big stumbling block, to issues of reforms.
Yes.
And of course, with the political disinclination to bring about these reforms, what do you think African countries will need to start doing, to be able to find the voice and, of course, the representation that they need to be able to start changing these rules to reflect Africa's interest, to also reflect these calls for global financial architecture reforms?
That's a very difficult question about, we certainly know what needs to be done. As to whether it can be done is another matter, but it doesn't mean that African countries should stop strategizing, planning, advocating together with their allies and their friends at the state level, at the regional level, but also with civil society groups. I think it's very important to keep the pressure up, because you just don't know when the moment for an opening to undertake some of these reforms might occur. I mean, at the moment, the United States may be shooting itself in the foot and with a tariff war and the rise of China. And so I think those geopolitics, the fact that they're shifting, may be beneficial to Africa if Africa strategizes in a way that might inure to its benefit. Now, having said that, I think quota reform in and of itself, based on the current formula for determining quotas in the IMF, may work against African countries, because if it's based on economic size, following the pandemic, following the indebtedness, there might be ways in which the formulas that are currently in place may put a limit on fundamental reforms. So there are barriers, and the barriers are real barriers, but there are also openings, and those openings, I think, must be mobilized and taken advantage of to the extent possible. So you can never say no. I mean, I think the whole fight about SDRs is only, as you suggest, one part of what African countries could do to try and reform the global debt and financial architecture. It doesn't mean that if there are more allocations of SDRs, that necessarily changes the underlying dynamics. SDRs are not a cultural solution to the problems that many African economies face. And, SDRs have many other problems. They come with conditionalities. The rechanneling has all sorts of bottlenecks that look very much like the typical lending scenarios that are problematic in the first place. So I think, African countries in the last few years have, undertaken a variety of initiatives, as you know, the whole idea of the Africa Club, and raising their voice about things like the credit rating agencies. But I think the most important initiative that provides perhaps relief in the medium to long term is this idea of a comprehensive, fairer debt restructuring framework. This time not based in the IMF, where the quota system, as we have already discussed, is based on the number of shares you've paid in, but rather in the United Nations, where each country has one vote, if such a system can be established in the United Nations, where every country has one vote and no country has more votes than the other, and where the system is binding on all countries, so it would require a treaty framework, I think that would go a long way towards at least addressing some of the immediate problems that we are facing with things like the common framework that are long, they are complex, they are very expensive, and so I think this idea of a comprehensive treaty addressing restructurings is well overdue. Maybe perhaps even with a global debt authority, which, by the way, is not a new idea. It was proposed in UNCTAD decades ago. So it's an idea that's coming back in terms of its relevance and importance. So that's one concrete idea. I have several others, but I think that is one that is not dependent on the quota problem that we have just discussed.
Yes, you mentioned something interestingly about African countries strategizing. You also mentioned something around the Borrowers Club and some initiatives that have been taken, and then you talked about multilateral process addressing these issues. I just wanted also to bring you back to Africa in terms of Africa strategizing. Are they doing enough already, or what is it that they need to start doing differently, actually, in terms of strategizing? Because you mentioned that, which I think it's important, and you mentioned initiatives that have been taken. How sufficient are they? And what does this call for, taking this through a multilateral process? What window of opportunities does it bring, and how can African countries work towards actualizing this?
Yeah, so I think what we have seen are a splutterings of initiatives led by a variety of African presidents. So, for example, the whole idea of the Africa Club led by the Kenyan president, the Zambian president, and the Ghanaian president. They had an editorial in The Economist maybe 2 years ago now. They've also been efforts to create an Africa Credit Rating Agency. The point I'm making is that these efforts have not been efforts at a regional level, meaning that the African Union hasn't really taken this problem by the horns and sort of dealt with it as an institution. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, not that conferences are something to go by, the first debt conference organized under the auspices of the African Union was held a couple of weeks ago. And so I think it's important for the African Union to give the same importance is given to trade, for example, under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AfCFTA, to questions of debt. Because after all, there wouldn't be much trade without sufficient finance. These are really questions that go to the heart of many African Union programs and initiatives and projects identified under Agenda 2063, including plans on industrial transformation, plans on transforming African agriculture. All those things would not be achieved without looking at the questions of finance. Now, there are many initiatives being pursued outside the African Union, like the African Financial AFMI initiative that is really sort of mostly banks, including Afrexim Bank and others, the African Finance Corporation, that sort of have been leading efforts around availability of finance, but not necessarily reform of the global debt and financial architecture. So even while we have had, the suggestions of an African debtors club, I don't think it has received the salience that we have seen associated with, like, let's stick with trade, the AfCFTA, which not only has had many champions, more champions than perhaps we have seen for questions of debt, but now has its own secretariat and its own entire treaty system headquartered in Accra. So I think African countries need to take this much more seriously. I certainly do understand that part of the hesitation is that our ministries of finance, planning, and economic development are overwhelmed with immediate questions on debt repayments and much more immediate questions about sort of domestic mobilization of resources. But this is an equally important, the question you're asking about doing this at a regional level is an equally important question, and I do hope that more salience is given, perhaps under the new leadership elected to head the African Union Commission.
Okay, thank you. Then there is this initiative at the level of the African Union also coming from the legal perspective, this African legal support facility within the African Union. Maybe for us just to wrap up this discussion, the importance of these legal aspects around these issues, because debt are very binding issues, legally binding when you contract debt, and also reforming the global financial architecture is based on rules that are also guided by legal frameworks. What, in the broader lens, of the rule of this, how countries can actually, focus on this rule of the legal aspects of debt and development finance, which seems neglected because the economic side receives a lot of attention, very much so to the neglect of the legal aspects.
So I think there are two buckets of problems. One is that when countries are contracting debt, all of the legal advisory, in fact, even financial advisory work, is done externally. If you look at most public financial management laws across many African countries, they allow the Treasury to effectively hire foreign firms to do all the preparatory work necessary to procure foreign debt. I think that's a big problem. So let's begin there. I think the problem is that we have wanted to integrate too quickly within the global financial system, and therefore we've externalized the expertise necessary. And therefore, the second problem is, in my view, the very important work that the ASF, the Africa Legal Support Facility, which now I understand is distinct entity from the African Development Bank. Initially, it was housed within the bank, but now it's outside. It's sort of a gap filler. A gap filler in the sense that they are providing the kind of legal assistance necessary for contracting debt, all sorts of debt instruments and advisory services at better rates than would be available in the marketplace, in the marketplace where governments typically are borrowing. But I would say these are, as important as that solution is, it's a band-aid solution. I think that we should democratize this legal knowledge about how you actually write debt instruments. This should be taught at every law school in the continent. Every lawyer who graduates from any university that is accredited in their country should know something about sovereign debt and the writing of these contracts. And important clauses in these debt contracts. Why should these debt contracts always have to have a clause that provides it's the law of London or the law of, the UK for bonds, Eurobonds, or New York law for bonds taken out in the United States? Why does dispute settlement have to be in arbitration? Why not in national courts? I think these are fundamental assumptions about how this system runs that we've taken for granted and which we don't challenge and we don't talk about because we take the system as it is. And that is what happens when you hire external advisors, because that's what they know. Now, the justification I think a lot of financial advisors will tell you is that we need to comply with the laws of the jurisdictions where they're procuring these loans. But you also have to comply with local law. So, for example, in Kenya, there are requirements for disclosure and transparency. If you're going to hire these firms, they've got to be hired through transparent processes. We've got to know how much they're getting paid, so they're not padding their loans. If you've taken a domestic loan, anyone who's taken a domestic loan knows that at the closing, you take your loan minus a significant percentage for the lawyers and other transactional fees. And that's the same for the sovereigns. We, the borrowers, the public in African countries, we just have no access to all these transactional details, how much all these intermediaries are being paid, why the governments are choosing these specific intermediaries and not others, whether there are other ways of arranging these debt instruments that are more beneficial than otherwise. We need to disabuse ourselves that all this has to be done externally, whether it's in terms of the expertise or the litigation, or when there's a problem. All these are not things that we should, assume that have to be done elsewhere, especially because the people who are going to pay this debt are the public, the citizens. So the domestic institutions matter, but they only matter to the extent to which those that are involved in borrowing are at the national level, or, as you know, there are many debts now also being taken at the sub-regional level. Some cities are taking out bonds for their water infrastructure. And these are binding on the central government. And many of these contracts, they don't go through any parliamentary approval. They don't go through approvals in many countries through the Attorney General. All these entities are operating independently of each other. So that's a problem.
The current context, Prof, where you have African countries struggling with debt, maybe due to the nature of the global financial architecture, due to issues of rating agencies, and the methods that they use in terms of also assessing that sustainability. In your view, right, what's supposed to change in these arrangements? And of course, the options of debt restructuring, apart from just what we have had, that should actually put African countries on a sustainable debt path.
Yeah, so I think that some of the very achievable reforms that are not written into the agreement establishing the International Monetary Fund, meaning there are no legal barriers to changing. One is the debt sustainability analysis, as you mentioned. The debt sustainability analysis that is used, what it does is to assess a country's ability to reorganize its internal economic affairs to enable it to repay its debt. That's all it's doing. Yeah. And so you might say there's really a conspiracy between the IMF and African governments or indebted governments, because as long as the debt sustainability analysis shows that they're capable of meeting their obligations, they might get, and then they're able to meet all sorts of conditionalities with austerity, which we shall talk about in a minute, then they're going to get an IMF program, which is a signal to the private market that perhaps, that country is ready to have private creditors advance them loans. So I think the two most important recommendations for reforming debt sustainability analysis is to make them sensitive to questions of human rights. Mm-hmm. And the second one is on questions of climate justice. Mm-hmm. So whatever they do with the formula, it's got to be sensitive to questions of human rights. That sort of, for example, for governments to be able to meet their obligations to their citizens in terms of housing, education, health. I think in almost every African country you've had challenges governments have with meeting their budgetary expectations for basic services to their citizens. And obviously also for purposes of climate, questions of climate justice, making sure that our countries that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis are able to meet their obligations to their citizens when we have floods, when we have fires, when we have all these disasters that they can't really, or even pandemics that make this worse, that they can't do without the kind of resources that are being channeled out of the continent. So that's one. DSA needs to be addressed. The other is austerity. I think the IMF calls it fiscal consolidation. This is the idea that, again, for purposes of domestic resource mobilization, which in my view simply is to say, tax the people so that you can get enough money to pay your principal and interest, without any concern for government's other obligations to their citizens. I think austerity is very negative, and I think it's important for social protection to become salient again in the financing framework and in the way in which the conditionalities of the International Monetary Fund are structured. So the regressive taxes we see that are typical in any budget, the removal of subsidies for all sorts of public goods, those are really negative. And you can already see the reaction of African publics in almost every country where this has been tried for the last several decades, and including in this year, especially the Gen Z revolution in Kenya. We have seen protests, protesting not just the government, but the IMF. African citizens know that these governments are working hand in glove with the International Monetary Fund. And in fact, in one recent case in Kenya, the International Monetary Fund has been joined in a lawsuit surrounding the question of debt. Claimed that some of the debt is odious debt because it was borrowed without following domestic legal and other requirements. Finally, I think another very achievable reform is debt cancellation. I think that the economists would tell you that one of the moments that Africa had to really breathe without the debt burden over their shoulders was the highly indebted poor countries initiative from a couple of years ago. And economists have convinced me that that space that was provided by HIPIC demonstrates that was one of the periods of the highest growth in African economies, something that we really need badly. And the fact that we have more debt burdens, which obviously we have to equally blame African countries for, this is not just a product of the global financial system, is an indication of the importance of thinking about another Jubilee moment of cancelling debt in a way that obviously does not create incentives for more borrowing, but creates the space for these countries to grow. And we know that cancellation works. In 2003, the US led the world to cancel Iraqi debt. Completely, and both through executive orders from the President of the United States, but also through United Nations Security Council resolutions. After the Second World War, through the London Debt Agreements of 1952, there was massive debt cancellation for Germany. It's become a very successful economy, in part because of those debt cancellations. So I think it's really important to keep debt cancellation on the table. It's a very controversial idea, but it's an idea that many civil society groups and many African governments are calling for. And I think it's, in addition to some of the... Yes, it's worth, it's worth the fight. Because otherwise, most of these economies are paying only interest. They're not even paying the principal amounts. And when these payments bunch up, it means, teachers can't get paid, students can't get the money in the schools, to pay their teachers. There is no money for the hospitals, really basic needs. And so I think it's really important to keep debt cancellation on the table. It's an important part of the conversation for changing the global debt and financial architecture, and it's the right thing to do.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you once again. And that was very insightful, and we look forward to also having more of these conversations to benefit from these insights.
Yeah, and thank you very much for the invitation and for the work Aphrodite is doing.
Thank you.